Hello and welcome to this film commentary for the 1974 Black Christmas, the original and best. I don't think I'm going to have too much argument with that. I'm Proper Horror Show and I'm recording this as part of my history of Blockbuster video project called Rental Breakdown. And this commentary is going to address quite a few things, but one thing that I'm not going to focus on as much is how Black Christmas relates to the history of the slasher genre. I'm going to discuss it a little bit, but I think that ground is quite well covered. Obviously, this film is pivotal, it has a huge influence, and I'll be mentioning it a bit, but I also want to cover aspects of how Black Christmas relates to wider themes of the time and to wider horror, so aspects of feminism, of paedophobia, and some of the underlying contemporary social fears that drive the nature of the horror in this film. We've just seen some of the credits come up there. That's Roy Moore, who, from what I can tell, really only did a tiny bit of work on this in the 70s, and then after that has gone very quiet. He's credited in the 2006 and 2019 execrable remake of Black Christmas that really has nothing to do with this film. But that's only for creating the characters. As far as I can tell, he's had no other input on this. The director, of course, is Bob Clark. And that sign on the sorority door that you saw just there is going to change quite a lot. The naming of the sorority changes throughout the film. This really has no impact on the story, but it is just a weird thing that I noticed. That is a real house that they used. They did not use sets. They got access to this and they dressed it up. From the interviews, it seems to be quite a tight filming location, but I think they do an extremely good job of disguising that and do a really good job of utilising the space in there. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention at this point that we have switched into a subjective cam, a hallmark of the slasher genre that gives you a bit of tension because we break between the objective camera like we have here and then a subjective camera. Subjective camera when we know we are for the most part, seeing through the eyes of the killer, who I will refer to as Billy, although obviously he is not given an official name in the film. One of the aspects of Black Christmas that has really added to its durability, to its legend, is some of the subtlety around this, the mystery of Billy, in contrast to some of the films that drew inspiration from it, where your killer really is just a man in a mask. We'll delve a fair bit more into who and what Billy is. We're seeing already one of the interesting ironies in the film, that Billy is getting access by climbing up the trellis there, breaking into the sorority that way. And we've had that established early on, but there's going to be a bit of a deal made there about locking the front door. It's one of those really sort of bitter, dramatic ironies in this film. They'll make a big deal about locking the front door, and we already know Billy has got a way in another way. The film will also use a little bit of a doubt over whether we're in the subjective cam or the objective cam later in the film to make you wonder, are we seeing people being watched by Billy right now? Are they in more danger than we think? And that's one of the delightful things that make this film a lot more intelligent than a lot of the others in this genre. And we'll be dissecting a lot of the imagery there. But before I go much further on that, when I was doing my research for this, I watched a 40th year anniversary panel with some of the actors in this. So Art Hindle, Nick Mancuso, who's the voice of Billy, John Saxon was there. And Nick Mancuso, the voice of Billy, he asks, why on earth, of all 300 movies he's done, why did this film enter your unconscious mind and mesmerise you and make you want to come to the panel? I found that a really telling question. As I learned, he did about 3 days of work on this film 40 years ago in 1974, and he was still being asked back to talk about it, which I think should tell you a fair bit about how important this film is, that people still care to be talking about it this later on. And I guess I see it as part of the work of this commentary to unpack that and explain why people would still come back to Black Christmas over and over again. I could have done a commentary on Halloween, maybe that's what would be expected, but I just find Black Christmas so much more interesting, so much more involving.
Oh, come on, you gotta be kidding.
We see Art Hindle there, someone I'm really happy to see. He's playing a character called Chris. His girlfriend there is Claire. And Art Hindle really features a lot in some of my favourite horrors of the 70s. I know him best from Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Brood. But even late in 2016, he was starring in The Void, a really excellent Lovecraftian film. And he's done a lot across the years. He came back and he worked with the director Bob Clark later in Porky's, in other projects. He had a good working relationship, and when you're doing research on this film, you see Art Hindle turns up a lot. He has a lot of lovely stuff to say, very insightful, and quite a nice humorous take on a lot of things about the film. Quite a few fun anecdotes to recount. We should point out that this is a Canadian production. It was being filmed in a very cold Toronto. One of the things that Black Christmas is really interested in that definitely fascinates me here is its underlying worries about social decay, especially sort of moral decay in the youth, how safe they are, what kind of environments they're in. This is a recurring theme, pops up over and over again in horror, almost in cycles. I mean, in the early 70s, you have Clockwork Orange, you have The Exorcist, and we're of course 2 years away from The Omen, perhaps the ultimate film worrying about the moral status of our children. I've just noticed in the bottom right hand corner we've got a little cat cameo there from Claude. Here though, it's a bit more mature, it's focused on a sorority and all-female environment, and I think understandably in this time of quite notable women's liberation, second wave feminism, there's a lot of concern and worry about women in the world. Here, really early on, even though they're in what you might call a safe space, an all-women's environment, via the telephone, someone very unpleasant, very dangerous has access to them. One very surprising thing about this scene is the absolute depravity of the language in there. I'm not repeating any of it, I'm afraid, but this is extreme language for 1974. We have to remember this, 1974, this is being done. And the language there is absolutely intense. And I think that's partially because this is a Canadian production, so standards were slightly different. It was different studios in control of it. And the Canadian government was really encouraging these kind of films. I think they had a lot more leeway from commentaries, from discussions about this. There was a bit more eye on commercial success and a bit of a laxer hand over what went into the film, which is, I think, where you get this sort of really extraordinary language. And I love this tracking shot that goes across them all and their reaction, almost like a quite muted response to this just disgusting language. But what the actresses were actually listening to there was the director Bob Clark ad-libbing and delivering much milder stuff. From their recounting, it was a lot more PG than this 18. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't the vile language that they're hearing. And it's made all the actresses sort of underreact to it, which for me has this impression of they're a bit ground down, they're a bit used to it. I mean, it's not pleasant at all, but you get this feeling that they may be a bit more used to it, which is getting that idea that this sorority environment isn't safe. And as we're going to see, it's definitely not wholesome. Now, the director is going to disagree with me quite vehemently, and I should state that now. That is one of the things that really interested me here. The director in his commentary ends up taking a very different view of the film that I had formed from watching it a few times. And so we're also going to get into quite a lot of a death of the author territory in this commentary, which I'll touch on as we go along. Now in that cast, I've already talked about Art Hindle. I should note Margot Kidder there, Olivia Hussey, famous at the time for Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, and for me, I think quite noted for a very good turn as Norman Bates' mother in the extremely underrated Psycho 4, The Beginning. On Margot Kidder, something that you notice about Margot Kidder, she has a choker there with the word yes on it. Maybe an odd item now, but for me, I see that as very indicative of her character, Barb, being very into sexual liberalism. And we're going to see that while she has something of a position of seniority in the sorority, she's really not a good example at all. Say hello to Claude the cat. Iconic enough to feature in the 2006 and 2019 Black Christmases. They made sure they had a cat like Claude in. Maybe not crucial, but very recognisable. I also note that Margot Kidder insisted on drinking real liquor in a lot of those scenes. She has a take on this film which I disagree with massively. She was very... she doesn't take it particularly seriously, and she and the director were both very keen on the comedy aspects of Black Christmas, which for me never really land that well. And I don't have a lot of patience for them, but I think the fact that she has such a preference for it is indicative to me that she didn't take this film as seriously. I see a huge amount of artistic merit in it. Little things like the character indications we have here, a stuffed toy on the bed looking worried, and a giant flower there. The giant flower to me looks, in Claire's room there, it looks like an eye, like the kind of deranged eye that we will get a close-up of later in maybe our best shot of Billy towards the end of the film. It's sort of indicative of her being watched, as they're all going to be over the course of this film. The soft toy, of course, an indicative of her innocence. And when we get shots of the attic, we're going to see that there are other signs of childhood innocence that have been put away. They've been stuffed up in the attic and they're dusty. That also feeds into this idea that the film's concerned with where our children, particularly where our daughters, are being sent, that they're being sent to an environment that is not safe for them, is not wholesome, and has a corrosive effect on them. So symbols of childhood innocence, they're put away, they're locked out, and they're surrounded by far more adult fare. The director, Bob Clark, he talked in his commentary about wanting to avoid the kind of silliness in portrayals of college. He wanted to cover a lot of realistic detail, desensationalise it, treat it a lot more adult. And so you've got these women who are... I think it's generally handled in quite a mature way, but you see a range of more mature women in this film that I really appreciated, as well as, say, more innocent, more vulnerable characters, like Claire, who unfortunately has just been often taken into the attic. Now, here's something I did have a real problem with, and the director will have a problem with. The housekeeper character there, I'm afraid her name escapes me at the moment. This is part of the comedy of the film, and it's something that fails for me. You have to ask yourself, why has she gone to drink hidden alcohol when the girls have just been having a party? There is booze all over the room, freely available, and everyone is in a party spirit. Would they criticise her if she started drinking some of the booze that is freely out there? I don't think so. But it's a joke that the director based on his aunt, a bit of a revealing comment there. And even he criticises them going to the sort of comedy alcoholism too many times. I believe it's about 5 times over the course of the film. And in his own commentary, he said, "I hope I don't do that again after the 3rd one." I want you to ignore Andrea Martin there playing Phil and focus on Olivia Hussey. Olivia Hussey's jumper there, with the hands crossing, you notice that is, it's suggestive to me of a sort of sexuality. It's the hands across the chest, hands across her breasts on her jumper. Already talking a little bit about the kind of environment she's in. And we're going to find out that she's pregnant, which is going to be a major storyline for her. Right now she's talking to to her boyfriend on the phone, played by Keir Delay. And she also wears a cross, which is a bit of a tension. Like I read that as she's gone in as quite a religious Christian girl, she's wearing her cross. But in this environment, she's been exposed to a lot more, say, adult situations. And so she's ended up in an adult relationship and is now pregnant as a result of that, and not entirely happy about that. That's going to be the tension for her. I also noted something that Barb said earlier. She objected, whilst a bit drunk, to living like she's in a convent. We're going to see this is definitely not a convent environment. Here we are hitting the alcoholism joke up again. As I say, I don't have a huge amount of patience for it. I'd also question, it's played for comedy, but you have to think, would people not see that string leading into the tank? Would they not question that? It seems a daft thing. Nevertheless, the housekeeper is an important character. She establishes a lot of the tone, for me, a lot of the messaging about the fact that the adults who are meant to be in charge of this are really not a good influence on the girls, not keeping them safe. And here, we're also seeing that it's already too late for Claire. Quite tragic. We're confronted very instantly, but without a big, kind of, say, jump scare bit of music that we might hear typically, with the fate of Claire. And it's a haunting image. It's a very good one. We'll return to it too. But you might ask, why does she look like that? There's something about this imagery of her with the mouth open in plastic wrap that has a slightly sordid pornographic element to it. But also in the way that she's wrapped in plastic and she's kind of been preserved. That's some deeper imagery we'll try and touch on later. Right now, I want to talk about my favourite character in the film, Mr. Harrison. He is the best character going. He is a foreshadow for me of what is best known as the Wes Craven rule. And that is the rule that to make a good and worthy horror film, you have to remember that even though you are showing, or perhaps particularly because you're showing absolutely horrific things happening to people, terrible fates, agony, you have to remember that these people are humans who have real relationships. They have family who are going to mourn them. They have friends who are going to worry about them. They have co-workers who are going to wonder where they are, why they haven't turned up. And that is a function that Mr. Harrison serves for me here. I find him incredibly touching. Also, breaking out of the tendency of slashers to live in a world of basically only teenagers where the adults are sidelined. This is something that Wes Craven does in A Nightmare on Elm Street, but is also wise enough to know he's doing it and bring the adults in and sort of highlight how distant they are. Now, whereas I think that commentary really isn't there in, say, something like Halloween, which I'm not saying is a terrible film at all. What I'm saying here is I absolutely love that Mr. Harrison has turned up to look for his daughter. And it's already too late, and it just makes him an extremely tragic character. That adds a huge amount of pathos to the film. He will be effectively silent for most of this movie, but his presence is a reminder that what has happened to his daughter is tragic. Here again, we're getting imagery of the kind of sordid, how can I say, degenerative, corrupting environment that his daughter's been in. He's encountering it for the first time, and maybe he's a bit of a proxy for a lot of adults. He's seeing this environment his daughter was in and just starting to wonder, gosh, where did I send her? Who's been looking after her? It's played up for a bit of comedy here, but I think there's quite a deep theme here. As I said, something that will come up over and over again because it's a perennial concern. Parents are always going to worry about the environments their children are in, and they've been sent away here and clearly have not been kept in good moral standing. We've also followed this scene is following the scene I hate the most, with Margot and Phil and another character there who is playing Santa Claus. Just being vile, really. Being corrupt, not taking the Santa all seriously, being drunken while they're doing it. Just being an awful influence. And I think that contrast there between seeing the kids being exposed to their terrible behaviour when they're meant to be setting a great example of running a lovely festive event, and then moving straight into this as a continuation of that, make you wonder about this environment, and you should be shocked at it. Now, the director, I think, has quite a different take on it. He sees, he drives a lot of comedy from it. He sees it as kind of a liberating thing. And it's quite interesting that he would go on to make Porky's. He would be, I guess, continuing to sort of revel in what you might say is a bit of moral decay. I realise you might be coming into this commentary thinking, crikey, have I pulled up a Peter Hitchens column? Let me at least say I'm going to try and give you an analysis of the film you will not get anywhere else. By the way, I noticed that portrait of the boy there, and I just kind of thought that he looks like he looks shocked, like it's an old vintage portrait, but it looks to him like he's shocked at what he's seeing. He's wondering maybe what has happened to the institution that he knows. I wonder if it was deliberate, but I don't think it was. From the director's commentary, what we get is that Bob Clark has a very different view of this. He sees it as comedy. I very much don't. But I lean on the interpretation, I think best summarised by E. Michael Jones in his book Monsters from the Id, that horror is often deeply unintentionally reactionary, though what we use as a source of horror is coming very deep within us, very sort of lizard brain response that we aren't necessarily aware of, but it's a deeper response to things we are worried about, and that horror therefore is often about punishing these transgressions and returning to a baseline, in contrast to the very sort of maybe modern liberal ideas we express on the surface. Deep within us, we will have these concerns that are a lot more traditional. We are about to have a very tense discussion on abortion, huge contemporary issue, and we're also seeing Keir Delay for the first time. His inclusion in this is really interesting to me.
I'm pregnant.
Obviously, he is best known from 2001: A Space Odyssey with Kubrick, and I think there's a very interesting Kubrick connection later. Something that I think had a profound influence on an iconic bit of imagery from The Shining. When that comes up, I'll comment on it. But I note that they had a very short amount of time with Keir Delay when they were making this film, so he had to really cram his scenes in, and a lot of things were prepped and filmed with Art Hindle standing in for him, and even Nick Mancuso dubbing a couple of his lines. But they were making the best of the talent that they had available. They also got very lucky with John Saxon coming onto the scene to replace an actor who, unfortunately for health reasons, was not able to continue the role that he'd been hired for. This scene is really where my understanding of the film was completely flipped over.
Do you know how important this afternoon is to me?
Yes, I do.
Why did you just get out of here?
So notice that Peter is kept in the background, kept blurry, and the focus is on Jess. Now this is quite intentional because she is obviously more of our protagonist, but also the director wants your sympathy to be with Jess. This is a scene that really got me focused on the death of the author element here, because the director really has 100% sympathy with Jess and 0 for Peter, which really surprised me given some of the imagery and directing in this film and some of the editing in this film. We'll talk about it when it comes up, but it really shocked me, and that is why I talk about this sort of unintended traditional reactionary impulse in horror. The director, in his own words, has this very liberal point of view, and at the same time, this film seems to me to be having a much more complex message than that. I also liked the use of the dual focus diopter there. A couple of years ahead of Brian De Palma's Carrie, which is the film I associate most with that use of the dual focus diopter. And there it was used to keep your focus on Mr. Harrison, worried about his daughter, and the absolute degradation of Barb, who is going to continue to be the worst character in this film for me. I was also really disappointed to hear in the director's commentary him repeat what I think is a kind of a stereotypical cliche about women being underwritten in horror. I think generally in a lot of horror people are underwritten, and there is no shortage of women who absolutely carry the show. In fact, my tendency would be to say that because you focus more on final girls, it is generally women who are better written in horror generally. I also think this officer here is really served a very unfair role in this film. I just want to say this officer did absolutely nothing wrong, and it, again, a clash of values I have with this film. I see him carrying a fairly heavy burden of dealing with people like Barb here, who is just being absolutely awful. I mean, drinking in the day when... Anyway, she should be concerned more about Claire, and Mr. Harrison there, you note, as I said, basically silent in this scene. He's kept to the side. He has a little word then, but you'll see frequently he's just there despairing. Barb makes also a very off-colour fellatio joke that, again, the humour in this film does not tend to land with me. It's also quite an age joke now. It's old tech about how phones would have codes in front of them. It's I'm afraid it's a bit of a worn-out joke, and also for me it's sad to see that the nature of that joke really relies on this kind of innocence about, you know, fairly niche terms that has long since been degraded. It's sort of hard now to believe that an officer wouldn't know that term, or I suppose even that, say, a high schooler wouldn't know that term. In fact, they'd probably fail a class if they didn't know it. So weirdly, it's sort of relying on an innocence that has long since been degraded by society. I find Barb absolutely awful, and making a joke about this police officer not knowing that word lands very flat with me. On the other hand, some of the more dated tech in this film that I don't say it's a disparaging thing, I actually find it fascinating. When they later try and trace phone calls, actually seeing how that technology worked, I found really interesting, and also really worked with the tension in the scene because it was tied to physical action. We'll look at that later, but I just find maybe this is an element of the scene that has a bit of a values clash and also has not aged super well. I don't see how we're meant to be on Barb's side here. She's just kind of awful. Now, the mask doesn't particularly help there, but that is Art Hindle, who's actually a fairly experienced hockey player, knows what he's doing. And the director had a very fun joke here that as it was a Canadian film, with some tax relief, they did have to include at least one hockey scene to get their tax relief, and that kind of cracked me up there. I also like the work that they've done there, which definitely would have been tricky to get a bit of a reflection of the hockey action going on in front of Jess's face there. It makes the scene a bit more visually interesting. But that would have been very tricky to organise with the lighting. Something you pick up is that Bob Clark really knew his stuff technically. Art Hindle goes over quite a few examples where he really shows a lot of prowess, which helps a lot. It reminds me of Stanley Kubrick, who would be very much a jack of all trades when it comes to this. Talking about Kubrick and we're back on Keir delay. That's very handy. So here we're seeing that Peter's recital is absolutely ruined. Even if he's playing okay to me, you see the stress he's under there. He's not handling it well. He's also reminding me a lot of Malcolm McDowell there, who was nearly cast in that role. And this is why I find it so bizarre. We're apparently not meant to have sympathy for him. He's been told by Jess that, you know, she's got his child, but she's going to abort it. And she tells him this just before his most crucial exam, his recital there. Absolutely ruining it for him. She did not need to tell him then. She could have waited. Frankly, awful move by her. My sympathy, regardless of how you feel about pro-life, pro-choice, my sympathy in there is with Peter. He's just been wrecked, but I suppose it is part of establishing that the film does want him to be a potential suspect for the killer, right up to the end of the film, really. So I suppose that is why they are giving a bit of a motivation for him to be hostile. But nevertheless, it really does... I found myself having a lot of sympathy for him that the director evidently, self-reportedly, did not. Now here we're getting something also really important. An extra storyline here about another murder, a high school girl in a park who's 13 or so. And in covering this, we should talk maybe a little bit about the IRL inspiration. There's a little shot of John Saxon there. You will know him best, of course, from Nightmare on Elm Street. But I think he does a really good job here. I would have personally... I always thought he would be really quite good as Jack Torrance in The Shining if he'd been cast. But I shouldn't derail on that. I also don't like how he'll just leave the mother who's reported her teenage daughter missing. You notice that in the conversation about the teenage daughter missing, there's sort of an assumption that, of course, they'd go off. And this is following an assumption from the other police officer that, of course, a college student would just go off with a boyfriend and go missing. It's almost like this dropping of standards, the liberalisation which causes dangerous situations. You've seen it and then you kind of immediately see it track back onto someone even younger, which I think is kind of, to me, is a very clear messaging of this is a problem that will intensify. Now, most of the scene is spent with Barb being, for me, very unfunny and crude and awful, and Andrea Martin actually doing really well here, and Mr. Harrison just being a silent font of dignity. So while that's happening, focus on poor long-suffering Mr. Harrison. And I'll tell you a little bit about the real-life inspiration for Black Christmas, and there's a few of them here. I'll just do them all in one go. So the first is the case of 14-year-old George Webster, who in Montreal in November 1943 used a baseball bat and ran amok, injuring his younger siblings Mina, who was 12, Andrew, who was 8, and a family friend called Sylvia Cust. Now, Sylvia Cust was investigating a noise, a disturbance that she heard from outside, obviously huge amount of ruckus being made, and she comes in and George, playing innocent, says to her mother's hurt, and then when Miss Cust tries to help, he then takes out the bat and attacks her. Now she luckily escaped with only a fractured arm and severe head injuries, but George Webster's mother died. He killed her. That informed a bit of the backstory of Billy, which was in the director's mind and the writer's mind, but is never really spelled out, in my mind, for the better, the film. There was a second one as well, related specifically to the phone calls, and that is a man called Paul Michael Stefani. Stefani is known as the weepy-voiced killer, and this is quoting IMDb, by the way. And that moniker was developed due to his habit of calling the police after committing his crimes and confessing. And his ramblings and Billy's, they seem to me actually quite wildly apart. He's calling up confessing and broken and weepy. Billy is calling up distressed, sinister, abusive, doing multiple voices. And that seems to be very different to how it's described on IMDb, so I'd question that there. But apparently both were confusing, disorientating. So maybe that's it. Now, moving back into some of the really interesting symbolism, Peter is about to smash up the inside of the piano. Now, the character reason, he is super frustrated. His recital was effectively sabotaged by Jess. But there's more going on here. There's far more going on. He is destroying the insides of something he loves. Jess is about to, have an abortion. So do effectively kill something on the inside. That is what that symbolism is getting at. It's very interesting. I have done a video on the both pro-life and pro-choice messaging in horror films, and how they get their messaging across differently. I didn't cover Black Christmas in this, but I think I very much could have, in contrast to the director's intentions, evidently. I will heap a bit of praise on him here, because his decision there to not have a fairly perfunctory scene where Chris and Jess turn up and have fairly basic dialogue, fairly perfunctory dialogue where it would be obvious what they would say. Shooting it from the outside, I think, was a bit more interesting and a more concise choice. You notice this film is about 97 minutes and all. It's very efficient in its storytelling. Now, while they're out searching for the body of the 13-year-old here, I have to do the third connection to a real-life serial killer that was a bit of controversy. In January 1978, Black Christmas was due to be shown on NBC, but it was pulled because of a real-life incident that was a bit too close to the plot of the film. And that specifically is that in Florida State University, a man broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at around 2 a.m. and then attacked 2 female students who were in there. 2 were killed, 2 were brutalised, and thankfully survived. And there is quite a lot of attention on this case, as that attacker turned out to be Ted Bundy. And it's quite unfortunate that Black Christmas has so much interaction with real-life horror there. I think you get the impression here just how freezing it was to be filming that, and I think that is actually the first night John Saxon turned up to film this. So poor chap. Something I found in my research was that Art Hindle made a point of pointing out that fur coat is his, and it turned up in a couple of his movies. Let's move on from Black Christmas's impact on real life, very unintended and very unfortunate as it is, to Black Christmas's impact on the slasher genre, particularly on Halloween. If you're watching this commentary, you're probably a lot more aware of Black Christmas than most people. The line is typically that Halloween is your first slasher, and we can debate that, but obviously Black Christmas came first. But the connection is a lot stronger than that. Bob Clark recounts at around this point in the film a discussion with John Carpenter. Bob Clark originally did want a sequel to this. He wasn't going to do it at Christmas, but he thought it was powerful to focus on a holiday. And in fact, numerous holiday horrors spring up very soon after Black Christmas, even though it's this fairly small Canadian production. But his plan was that it was going to be set on Halloween. Now, he never ended up making this movie, but he talked to John Carpenter about it. And what does John Carpenter end up doing? Well, he takes a script called The Babysitter Murders and ends up turning it into Halloween. I'm not saying it's plagiarism at all. I think it's a very smart decision and very good evidence of how influential this film is, what powerful ideas are in it, that they had that effect. And I think very much like John Carpenter, though, Bob Clark, he never wanted to be a horror director. Like Wes Craven as well. Never wanted to be a horror director, but it is just a lot easier if you want to get into filmmaking to start with a horror movie. It's a lot easier to get the money. It's a lower budget to produce something that people will like. And also, horror fans are very forgiving, basically. You'd say that a lot of horror fans, they don't have high expectations and are quite easy to please. But listening to Bob Clark, he really objects to his film being called a slasher. I think he only did one other horror movie. He focuses on calling this a psychological thriller, and he expresses a lot of distaste for sort of cheap stuff. I think mostly for, say, more progressive reasons. He even was a bit harsh on himself in this scene about the realism of this particular kill, of character actually being hooked from a distance there. Now, I think there's actually quite a good reason for this, but we'll get into that later. Mostly I'm just interested now, we got a quick subjective vision, subjective camera, Billy in the attic. We're having so much dramatic tension here because we know the setup, and now that she realises she's in danger, it's not as funny now, and Billy's going to launch the attack. All the setup and now the payoff. Yes, a little excessive, but you also notice no blood. Still really effective. And at this point, we haven't seen Billy. Now, we are maybe primed to think that Billy will be seen later if we harken back to Psycho. We might expect that Billy would be seen a bit later than this. I mean, there'd been a handful of giallo films already, which are Italian, I guess, horror thriller slashes, where the identity of the killer is kept rather secret, so maybe people were a bit primed for this, but the fact that we really never see Billy is quite wonderful, and that won't have landed for audiences yet. They're probably still expecting something a bit generic. Back in that subjective cam there, Billy's admiring his work here, admiring what he's done, but then still flipping out. I find his rage so interesting. Think in slashes how much you just see the silent stalker killer. Billy, a lot more ambiguous and a lot more, very different to a type that would become standardised. Although it should be said that, say, Black Christmas's mix of comedy and horror is something that would be a lot more characteristic later in the years of slashers. Mr. Harrison there just being a sort of effectively silent reminder, a sort of dignified figure reminding you that something tragic has happened, something awful. And we're about to see this really brilliant bit of editing where things are connected, there are implied connections. So the people outside looking for a body to moving suddenly inside. We're almost wondering here, is this Billy outside admiring his handiwork, or is this someone else? We've got that image there of Claire has been preserved, like her innocence has been preserved, except it hasn't. She hasn't been kept safe. And you also see that the housekeeper there is hooked. Now, I read that as a comment on her alcoholism, the alcoholic is literally hooked on something. But after that scene of horror, you notice we very swiftly cut to people screaming in reaction to something different, in this case the discovery not of Claire, who we know is up in the attic, but the discovery of 13-year-old Marceline. Mr. Harrison here, remaining silent, but the mother coming in. And the mother's scream being cut off by the phone. The phone calls are going to typically come after each murder, and that will give you a little clue how to interpret the ending of this film. But the phone is also very important, in my reading, is the symbolism of how you aren't safe in this environment, how you can be got to. I love Olivia Hussey's reaction there. She takes it so seriously. She doesn't know how to react to this. It's really grim.
Who are you? For God's sake, what are you doing?
I know what you did, Billy! Filthy Billy! Billy! Billy!
This is just so unlike anything else you would tend to hear. Now, what Billy's saying there, I know what you did. Now, it's very interesting to me that Jess hears this. You can unravel a bit of Billy's implied story, but I know what you did, and stories about killing a baby sister. And the central, I guess the main plot for Jess is that she is arguing with Peter over whether or not to have an abortion to keep her child. And she gets called up by Billy, who accuses her of killing a child, killing a baby, saying, I know what you did. And then we also have this interesting tension where she is going to be extremely upset over Marceline's body. Totally upset about the body of the girl in the park, but she's about to go and, I'll just say have an abortion, because I'm trying to give this as value neutral a framing as I can. But there is an irony there. There is a deep irony in her sort of stated concern with her upcoming actions or intended actions that Peter is here to argue against. But listening to the director's commentary, the director didn't see that irony at all. By the way, watch out for Billy's shadow in this scene. You will be able to see it, and he is listening in at key points. That's something I really thought was very interesting. But what I want to say here was I found it so shocking that listening to the director, he thinks it's absolutely ridiculous that Peter would try and do what would be traditional, offer to marry Jess, take his responsibility seriously, become a father, that he is willing to stick with her and quit his dreams of being a performer so that he can get the money necessary to raise a child with her. And this is just treated as ridiculous by the director. He says, now, in fairness, the director is recording this commentary about 30 years after the film. So maybe his values have changed quite a lot in the intervening time, but it really surprised me. Because there are so many moments where the intercutting, the editing implies these connections between things that would give you an interpretation of this film that is, I would say, quite traditional, quite reactionary. And yet, apparently, that is not there. Now, that could, of course, be my own bias, but you never know. Mr. Harrison there also, once again, silent, just reminding you that something tragic has happened. I am looking out for Billy's shadow in this scene, as the director mentioned it in the commentary, and I didn't manage to catch it, so I'm going to look out for it. Something else that makes the director's intentions here so unexpected to me is sort of his own background. Now, you might expect that he's going to be more liberal simply because he is a film director in Canada. You know, he's also a baby boomer, which is a pretty good predictor of a more liberal outlook. And he also did get a divorce himself and have 2 sons. That he was raised by a single mother who's a barmaid, so not in any particular affluence. He very sadly lost his father in a car crash. But from that, I would just think that he would value a stable home of the kind that Peter is offering Jess here, the sacrifice that Peter is willing to make, and it just seemed so odd to me that he would describe this as absurd. I just don't see it. But then again, doing the research, his notes about this implied he didn't take it particularly seriously, and that he said this was basically something. He wanted to give them something to talk about, something to have conflict over, while the horror happened. Which sounds a bit dismissive, but then at the same time, I'd argue that your best horror directors tend to not be big horror fans. And the obvious example I'm going to go to is going to be Stanley Kubrick, or let's say Richard Donner, who did The Omen, which I absolutely adore. But I think because they're not so focused on making a genre film, they tend to focus more on making relatable humans and on human issues, and that makes it all the better. There's just rounding off a thing on Bob Clark is the very tragic thing that, like his own father, he would die in a car crash. He was hit by a drunk driver in 2007, and unfortunately one of his sons died with him. Really quite awful. And he'd become later quite a bit more concerned about what he put in his movies. In contrast to this, he makes a note of saying in his commentary that he kept alcohol out of his movies, and he started keeping smoking out of his movies. It's an interesting turn over the years. I'm also noticing there that little American flag, as he pointed out, is the one homage to it meant to be in America. Our two more sophisticated detectives there are having a laugh at Sergeant Nash's expense. This is the payoff to the fellatio joke earlier. I mean, it helps that it's sold by good actors, but it's a bit of a clash for me. It's a bit of a tonal clash. And again, I just don't think that Sergeant Nash did anything wrong here. Perhaps this kind of comedic intrusion there is a bit more of an indicator of Bob Clark's interest not being so much in horror but in comedy. But as I've said, even though he doesn't care about the genre particularly, he manages to make it work extremely well. And there is a big pattern of this, a very notable pattern in horror history.
I know. Something dirty, ain't it?
In this scene, I'm gonna take a little further look out for Billy in the corners. Hopefully she'll be able to spot him, because it's from listening into this scene that he's able to repeat some of the lines in a later phone call. Now that is meant to suggest that Keir Delay here, Peter, is making the obscene phone calls. I even wondered if it was someone who wasn't Billy just because of when they start coming, but I had to abandon that angle. But I was interested for a while if it was a completely separate person making dirty phone calls, because some of the dialogue does imply that they'd been receiving them long before Billy turned up now. Was he doing that from outside the house generally? It's entirely possible. This outfit that Keir Delay is wearing as Peter, I found that really interesting. I think we're about to see him next when we get something I thought was inspiring The Shining. I also find it very odd that they make a big shot of making sure you can see in that scene that Jess is wearing a cross when she's about to do something, not exactly approved of by the church. But again, that could be a commentary on the effect of the environment. There's a bit of a weirdness here. You don't have to make a big deal of it, but these characters sort of act like they haven't already met earlier in the film. I don't think it's a terrible error, but it does feel a little bit odd. It's a minor issue, really. We're also going to see some interesting OG phone hacking there. I'm afraid I did not manage to catch sight of Billy in that scene. Maybe you managed to catch him. When you're recording a commentary, your mind is always going over about 10 things at once, and you almost want to slow the film down to half pace so you can get everything in there, but it can be difficult. So if you saw Billy, well done. Maybe you rewound so you could catch him. You also got a really important bit of information dropped very casually. Roy Moore, good screenwriting. It's mentioned so offhand that there is a separate phone in the housekeeper's room, but it's on a different line. so they don't need to tap it. Now that thing about just casually, okay, he doesn't need to tap it, so he doesn't need to go in. But it's also setting up for the reveal that Billy is using that phone later. Something I really like about this scene is you'll notice this is a long, unbroken shot. Now, the camera is moving a little bit. We're not expecting from the positioning that this is actually a subjective cam. But the fact that we've got a little more movement and we're in the house is maybe starting to make us think a bit more of Billy watching, or maybe Billy just listening in. The fact that the camera is able to move a bit should just maybe make us think of Billy a bit more. Notice there with the poster, that slightly shady face over the back of Jess's shoulder there. This is also a long, unbroken shot, which adds naturally to the tension. It's a very, very nice move here, and everything is kept in frame. No cross-cutting. It's very nice. John Saxon at the time, alongside Keir Delay, they're the real stars of this film. They had the cachet at the time. So they're really getting the most out of them. That was a very nice touch again, just implying a subtle threat. Bob Clark really shows that he's got the instincts, that he could have been an amazing horror director if he'd wanted to stick at it and focus on it. He definitely could have made more amazing stuff, but like Kubrick, he kind of came in, did one absolutely amazing horror movie, changed the genre, and then leaves. Refuses to elaborate. John Saxon is bringing so much charisma in this. I do really appreciate it. It's very charming. But there is a slight tonal clash, I think. Like I noticed at this point, Phil was relaxed earlier. That's Phil on the right there. And now she's a bit more tense. You are really also getting the sense of the Dawson's casting here. I mean, it is natural that you would have more mature adults in the film, but they are all looking a fair bit older. I mean, Keir Delay was 38 when this was being shot. Yeah, there is that assurance that you're being watched, but again, like the assurance of being safe in a house with a locked door, it is not going to do much, as we should already know, because of course we know Billy's already in the house. This is a lovely bit of dramatic tension. Bob Clark noted from starting his film on the outside view there that there's that contrast between the darkness and light, so he wanted the sort of light uplifting aspect of Christmas and also the darkness of the things that were going to unfold. Peter there again being set up as a suspect, and I just
I'm sorry, Jess.
well, we'll see more of him later. Now again, this feels like a tonal clash, like a scene was cut, but this is quite a swerve. We're going to move again quite sharply onto comedy again fairly soon after this. I like Black Christmas a lot, but the tone of it is weird. I think potentially because Bob Clark was quite concerned about providing variety and moving to comedy. I don't think it's anything as I would typically frame it, as wanting to relieve tension that you built up one way or another. I don't see why you would particularly need to throw comedy at this scene. But we've seen it come up a few times. There's going to be another instance fairly soon where they're going to move quite swiftly onto joking. We're also wondering at this point, who is next? Phil is going upstairs to rest after getting absolutely smashed. Barb is already upstairs. And we've got the tension here. The tracker is installed, so now we're just asking, who's next? When's he gonna ring? So here we're seeing more of that old school phone hacking, phone tapping technology, which I mentioned earlier, which they do use to some great dramatic effect because it becomes a matter of, can you get there in time, etc. It's a reason for us to be invested in it, but also it's just interesting to see. I mean, next year, 2024, this film will be 50 years old. The Exorcist is celebrating its 50th this year. And it's just interesting to see that older world. Now this is really good stuff. Claire up there in the chair, now with a baby, you'll note, a a not particularly healthy looking baby in the chair being rocked by Billy. All the elements here are going to connect. Now we have Jess in the chair, Jess with her own baby, Jess looking up, and she's looking in the direction unintentionally of Claire. So she's connected to Claire. You're starting to wonder, when's the pin going to drop? That phone then connects you back to the police. I know I'm sort of saying what just is on screen, but I'm just trying to explain how I see it working. Then passing the buck back to Jess. It's this go around. Maybe maybe Phil is at risk because she's gone upstairs. Now we're focusing on Billy again. You're kept guessing between all the elements of where is he going to strike? Who is he going to go for next? This is a lovely bit of tension and similar to the previous intercutting of elements. The tension keeps you guessing. This is a really nice bit of editing and directorial work. But this move to Barb, in an environment we've never seen before, is a total swerve. We're going to notice, by the way, that she has a Che Guevara poster in her room. Again, what a sort of very similar to what I was saying about the concerns about the environment they're in. It's also something I find quite interesting that Barb has all these delicate little figurines. I mean, she's become quite an uncouth, unruly, not particularly reputable character, but in this, we're seeing a lot of, I'd say, a sympathetic side of her. Those delicate figurines strike me as something of a bit of a hidden side of Barb. Just like the asthma, it's a sudden vulnerability. We suddenly get a lot of sympathy for her. I mean, I do not like her as a character at all, but it's an intelligent little curveball that's served here. It is, of course, also a setup. Now we're aware of where the room is, we have a greater understanding. We'll be familiar with it when we see it the next time. So it's a setup and payoff situation. Now we're going to go back to another moment of irony and interconnecting here. I mean, this also feels like a quite an old tradition, sadly, something that I think feels pretty lost. I don't think I've ever seen door-to-door caroling in my lifetime. I'm in England, as you may have picked up from the accent, and I would love to see it, but it's never happened in my lifetime, sadly. It's a bit lovely to see. But again, this is something that surprised me. I am going very death of the author in this commentary, but it just astounds me that the director can see absolutely no irony whatsoever in Jess, who is pregnant and wanting an abortion, standing before a group of children singing "O Come All Ye Faithful." And this is being juxtaposed right here now with Barb is about to be offed. I just don't see how you put those two elements together, following a thing where Jess has been so concerned about the death of an innocent child in a park, like right close to her home, and now she's watching these lovely children, and we're not to see any kind of contrast in this, any conflict there. Now, personally, I do. As you pick up, you may not like the analysis, and that's absolutely fine. But I see it as something quite intended. There's something almost medical about that unicorn, almost syringe-like. I won't press that. I don't think that's a particularly strong line, but it is interesting. It's also unconventional in terms of murder, and it's going to be incredibly iconic. The glass unicorn would turn up in both remakes, as far as I remember. I can't say I'm exactly rushing to rewatch the 2019 one, and that shot is so wonderful. Since we're seeing that shot, I might elaborate a bit more on Billy, the kind of non-entity that is Billy, while we have this lovely thing. And when I say non-entity, that's not doing him down. What I mean is Billy for me in this is so much less a loose maniac and more of a reaction. Billy is more of a haunting as I see it. I think of him as kind of like a genius loci, so a spirit of a place, and in this case an evil spirit of a place. Very much like the film's the psychological horror Session 9, if you know that. And the genius loci is this evil spirit connected to a particular place, and in this case a sorority. And to my mind, Billy has effectively been summoned by what's going on there. So basically how can I say, let's just say the moral environment and the loss of innocence in the sorority is basically what has given rise to Billy. That is why he is there. That's maybe the deeper psychological motivation to bring him there. The fact that he's so conflicted, what he's talking about, the way he tries to, he gets Claire up, the most innocent one, up in the attic, preserved in plastic with a baby doll, and then has a sort of mother figure up there too, kept safe. That to me is a reaction to the sort of destabilising anti-family stuff happening in the sorority that nominally I think we're meant to be fond of. And the fact that Billy here is repeating the line to her, you can't treat a child like a wart to be removed. That is echoing back, as I said, it strikes me as a haunting. He's saying that to her because he's a response to her actions. Now, the director did actually give a backstory for Billy that he is similar to that real-life George Webster incident. He's someone who brutally attacked or murdered his baby sister and then attacked his mother and then escaped, but I think very wisely they didn't include it. Something else about Billy, I mean, the 2006 one just went too big in how much they showed, and my memory is not super clear of it, but the backstory changed a little bit and got very weird. We saw too much of Billy, whereas the lack of seeing him is an appeal. People might still be expecting to see more, which you never will, and that is what, that sort of refusal to satisfy the desire to see more of Billy is what works, but what gives this film so much longevity. But there's also the aspect that Billy, as I said, is a non-entity. He isn't even played by one person. Now, Nick Mancuso, who did 3 days' work recording the voice of Billy and doing all sorts of work to make that very memorable sound, he's one of 3 voices that make up the phone calls, which were looped in after the fact. So he's not like Roger L. Jackson being there on the set of Scream to be Ghostface. He's there being looped in afterwards. And Nick Mancuso is not playing Billy physically. Sometimes Billy's hands that we see were the hands of a cameraman. I think, was it Alan Dunk? I'm not certain. And then a different person stood in for close-ups of the eye. So many different people are Billy. And that's why I prefer to see him less as like a specific person and far more of this vengeful spirit arising from the corruption that is happening within the sorority. And that is what makes it so much more interesting than, a Jason Voorhees. We'll also note at this point we've had a couple of attempts to track Billy. We've had an attempt to track Billy that has failed. And we're going to see a lovely rule of 3 here. Here back in the subjective cam. Wondering, is this Peter watching them? Is this Billy? Now, clues have been dropped that it can't actually be Peter, but nevertheless the film will work to convince you that he is a viable candidate for the wrongdoer. That shot of the phone reminds us that he could call at any moment, and we should get another call fairly soon. I also really appreciate in this that Bob Clark allowed the film to get dark, not just in the sort of, mood. I like that he let it look naturally dark. here as well. It's just more believable lighting, even if just above the desk, it's where the light comes in is a little out of place with where the lamp is. It's still appreciated.
Hello?
I did also, I sort of skipped over it when it happened there, but that little routine that just we saw in the police station with a man shot in the backside by a farmer. Again, this is one of those moments of comedy that seems completely out of place to me that I have got to say, have very little interest in.
Yeah. It's Bill Graham. You want me to trace that one? Yeah.
So here's that second attempt to do the tracing. It will be foiled, it has to be foiled, because it's a rule of three. We want an attempt that fails, we want a subversive attempt, and then we want the payoff. Gosh, that's a lovely shot.
Where are you?
That is a lovely shot there.
Don't do this.
This close-up version really does add so much to it. I just don't see how you can listen to Peter begging for her to not kill... I don't see how you can hear Peter begging her not to have an abortion because it's his child about to be terminated and not have any sympathy for him. This is, it's complex, it's morally deep, and I was so surprised by how dismissive of it the director was. Now I think in his own mind what he's trying to do here is make more of a feminist point. So I think in Bob Clark's mind what he's trying to do is say, there's a killer on the loose and you're distracted policing women's sexuality. I think that's maybe the kind of line that you would take if you were doing a more feminist analysis. If you're doing a more feminist analysis of this film. Not saying I'm doing here, but I do try and understand a film from many different angles. Also, there's 100% Billy in the background. Again, just reminding you, if you want to take that line, they are focusing on policing her sexuality when Billy is right there. The fact that Phil just looks on gives a bit of solidarity there. I also really like this shot. This is so john lit. It's moody, it's atmospheric, and it's, John Saxon looks handsome there. He still looks handsome at the 40th reunion, to be honest. The man's got a fantastic profile. And here you have the information that exculpates Peter. Very good. There was a moment I wanted to cover earlier and I think I missed the specific moment. As I said, when you record a commentary, there's always about 10 things you want to say. But let's talk about maybe that connection between this film and The Shining. What I notice is Keir Dullea, who Stanley Kubrick had worked with on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he's wearing a dark green turtleneck. And that jumper struck me as incredibly similar to the one that Jack Nicholson wears in The Shining in a scene when he's staring out at Danny and Wendy, and he's looking at them, glowering at them, and I thought that glower looks a heck of a lot like what Keir Dullea is doing. And I wonder, did Stanley Kubrick sort of check back on what one of his old stars was doing? Maybe interested in casting him in something else, and then see that shot and think, okay, that looks powerful. Maybe his attention had been drawn to this either from Keir Dullea or because Malcolm McDowell was considering being cast for this. I don't know if the timeline probably doesn't work for that when Clockwork Orange was made. But just that imagery I thought struck me as very similar.
What are you doing? Some kind of search party. Yes?
Sorry to scare you, miss, but we're with the search party.
We've been allowed to forget about the phone a little bit.
Well, not until you got here. Well, they scared the shit out of me.
Sorry,
And now we have a new threat. This is an odd scene. We've just been just like the scene in the police station where the man's been shot in the rump. This is a scene that just I find very, very odd here. I don't know why it's played for comedy. I mean, I know that the actress who plays Phil is naturally more inclined to comedy, but I do find it very weird. It's Andrea Martin is her name. Comedy is, like the director, is more her instinct, but I just find this an odd scene. Like, these chaps are doing their civic duty, going around trying to help. I find it so weird that it's played for comedy here. It seems to be quite a tonal shift as well. I don't know why you would want the comedy in here. We're quite close to the ending here. The tension should just be building. Very odd. And in fact, on the director's commentary, Bob Clark did actually note that the guys were being helpful. Possibly his idea was, maybe he did want to get a bit of comedy in there, get the most out of his actresses, and then drop the tension so that you're maybe at ease, you've dropped your guard. That'll be a typical use of this technique. Joss Whedon enjoys it a lot. And I think here is also where we can notice that Barb has a Che Guevara poster in the room. I think you might have to look quite closely to see it, but it is there. Play the joke and then hit them with something awful. Also note, I thought that wreath was very telling, very on the nose. The wreath full of miniatures there. And here we go. Lovely signs, like just looking at the attic door and the light coming up, we get that indication of the threat increasing. I remember making a note of it. But unfortunately, yes, there is Phil going. Unfortunately, but of course there can only be one. When we're talking about this film being super influential on the slasher film, yes, we do have to have our final girl, which does mean that Phil is going to have to go, despite doing nothing wrong. She's very likeable in this. So now we are doing everything to secure ourselves, to give us some comfort, and a reminder that due to the dramatic irony, we know that is not going to work. So we, the audience, are a lot more primed. And here's that payoff. Actually seeing the dialing now. And from earlier in the film, we can work out which room it's in. We'll know it is the housekeeper's room. But of course, that just bolsters the casual line dropped by the police earlier, telling you everything you need to know. There is a separate line in the housekeeper's room. And now this just confirms Billy calls from there. But yeah, this is that third call. This is the payoff. So it's a big payoff. Not only do we understand the threat a lot more, but also this is when it's actually going to be a successful trace. It's also a great bit of tension, the fact that in order to be safer, to give a chance of catching Billy, she has to stay on the line. She has to expose herself to more danger. Classic horror thing that for the end, you have to expose yourself to more danger to survive. If you want to escape, you've got to go down into the basement. You've got to face your fear. And that is what Jess is going to have to do there. Olivia Hussey is not a horror fan. She's done a few of them, but she says that she really doesn't watch any horror. They affect her too powerfully. Nevertheless, she managed to do a really fantastic performance in this. Oh, it's such an unusual performance on that phone. So absolutely unique. I just think you don't know how to react to it.
A phone company's on the other line,
It's very different to something like When a Stranger Calls. Probably the best known example of the killer is coming from inside the house trope. And there is that news being very explicitly dropped there, yes. You even get the line, the calls are coming from inside the house, the absolute classic. A fair few have done this trope, of course, in the pre-mobile phone era. It's a bit of a classic. Now, I'd originally thought that When a Stranger Calls got there before Black Christmas. I thought it was done in 1972. I was wrong. It was done in 1979, 5 years later. So again, it's hard to appreciate how ahead of its time and innovative Black Christmas was when we are looking at it 50 years later, when things that it did first or did so well and more originally and more innovatively first became tropes and then became tired and then got worn out and then were done in a new meta way or made technologically obsolete. It can be hard to appreciate just how innovative this film is. Speaking of some of the horror tropes here, maybe let's talk about one of the classics, quoting Scream, that horror is always about some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she'd be going up the front door. It's insulting. Can you lay that charge of a bad horror trope on Black Christmas? Very much not. Very much not. The director goes out of his way to address this, and I think he's right to do so. Jess should go out the front door, obviously. She's going to be told, but she's concerned about her friends. She is a well-meaning individual. She does hesitate, she thinks about it, but she ultimately makes a decision. She thinks she can help. Maybe I'm a bit too harsh on the writer for disliking Sergeant Nash here, but having established that he's not a particularly bright character, they do go out the way to have him ruin the instructions here. He's been told explicitly not to tell her the killer is in the house, and he tries not to do it. If you wanted to be very cynical and go for a quick and easy joke, you could say that, well, Jess really should have listened to a man. I guess if she had been less feminist, she'd have come off better. Should have listened to the man. Obviously, that is a completely inaccurate, superficial reading of the scene. We have a guy who's, I think, portrayed a bit too unsympathetically, but he fails to persuade her, and then he gives her the information that he quite rightfully thinks would speed her out of the house. But Jess is concerned about the welfare of Phil and Barb, and also, I think, overwhelmed, completely overwhelmed. She's considering leaving. She's trying to shout to them. Can she save them safely? She's considering it. She's not just venturing into danger for no reason whatsoever. We're now getting this scan of different viewpoints. Were we in subjective cam? Were we in objective cam? Which one of those was Billy at? We're now just wondering because, and I think for my reading, I think he's like a haunting. Billy's kind of everywhere in the house. Billy's an emanation from the house, a genius loci. My reading not supported by any of the cast of the film, I should specify. She knows police are coming soon. She arms herself. She's terrified. She's not being an idiot. She's considering all of this. She's very tense about it. It really does make it amazing that they managed to get a house which had such a great environment for this. It was pretty decrepit when they found it. They did have to do it up again so they could do the film. And I gather it's still a bit of a tourist spot for fans because you can literally go and see it. It is still there. And now a really interesting change. We're in the subjective cam, but from Jess's point of view, it's destabilising, isn't it? It throws you off a bit. You associate it with more tension. Here we go. We have a lot more information than her in the scene, but from that last little scattershot series of visions where it could have been from Billy's point of view, we're now less certain where he is. So we're actually back with Jess. We were already sympathetic to her, but now we know about as much as her. It's about the only blood in that film, by the way. That would be the kind of classic payoff. You notice no one swung down from the ceiling, no one been stored in a cupboard to fall out. They've just been propped on the bed in a fairly natural view. And this is also the most we see of Billy. She actually manages to hurt him. That's brilliant. He's going to rush out now. But from that shot, that really iconic shot of him, oh, this is so good. Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. You still have not seen a huge amount of him, but from that shot of his eye, you know enough to know that it is not Peter. If you've been paying attention, you've had enough close-ups of Keir Delay. You know that his eyes are blue. You know that Art Hindle's eyes are blue. So Chris and Peter are ruled out. I mean, you've already had Peter sort of exonerated, but Jess will be doubtful of this. I must say, perhaps this is slightly unfair because she really should be less suspicious of Peter, but I guess at this point she's just going to be so scared that she's not sure. Now, it's also an interesting change here that she moves to the basement here. This is unknown territory. We don't know this environment. This is putting the audience more under tension because we don't know this. We've seen a lot of the house. We've never seen this before. This is full of dark, unexplored corners. And we are just as uneasy as Jess now. Is this leaning on a tradition of deep horror in the basement, like Psycho and Night of the Living Dead? Maybe it's leaning on that as well. We get a reminder police are on the way, but now it's very much a case of can you last out? Some really interesting lighting there, keeping it nice and sinister. A cage there echoing the cages in the attic, but this is still unfamiliar. I wonder if that was an accidental stumble. Okay. So Peter is about to be dealt a very rough hand. A very rough hand indeed. There's been investment in portraying him as a suspect throughout, and it's going to pay off finally. We, of course, don't know it's Peter at this point, but we will very soon. It's an unenviable situation. Again, how often in the film have you thought you're in a secure environment and that's just been increasingly undermined? Jess is going to retreat, and we're going to see some interesting symbolism in a moment. Now I've got to ask, why would Peter break in? I know plot-wise they want him to be killed off by Jess, but what's his motivation? I would prefer if he had a reason to break in, some alarm. Like, the obvious one is that he would have seen the policeman outside dead, and he'd be therefore super concerned. He's tried to get in the front door, but as we saw, Jess already locked that. And therefore, because of that, he's really scared, so he's intent on breaking in to save her because he's worried about her. But if he's doing that, he would need to, I think, give a bit more dialogue to explain what's going on. So it is a little bit of a weakness. Oh, this does look so good with the use of lights on his face, blocking him so you only just see the eyes. Again, you did just see Billy's eyes only, so they're trying to make that association. And remembering, we've only seen the outline of Billy, we've only seen the shadows.
Jess, are you in there?
Again, we have got that dramatic irony. We know what Jess is thinking.
Jess?
We should know that Peter's innocent, and I think we're intended to. I think we're very intended to know that he is innocent. Hopefully you can see that with his hairstyle, with his outfit there. Really reminds me of Jack Nicholson in The Shining.
Jess?
She's going to retreat and he's going to pursue as he's done many a time. He spotted her. There's going to be some really interesting symbolism. You may say that I'm reaching. Looking behind her, she has some coat hangers. Now, given that she's seeking an abortion, is putting coat hangers behind her accidental, like she's been retreated into a desperate situation and she ends up in a basement with coat hangers? Is that an absolute reach? It could be. It could be. Anyway, it all pays off now. After very tense, slow movements there, everything is kicking off. And we don't know what's happening. We're spared this because, well, partly because this film, while it has absolutely extreme language in the phone calls, it's otherwise quite genteel. I mean, if you censored those phone calls, you could have something that's borderline a 12. And here we're just waiting to find out what's happened. This doesn't feel entirely like our typical slasher, to be honest. I think because these tropes haven't been formed, we are waiting to find out what happened. Were they both taken out together? We are given a chance to think. Yeah, look at those blue eyes. 100% not Billy. We're given a little moment to wonder, is Jess also dead? Before we are led off the hook.
I knew it in my gut it was that kid.
But you are held in suspense there. We are pretty much at the end of our film. Jess is now drugged and we're getting our resolution. I will say this scenario is... there are some shenanigans to justify leaving Jess alone here. The doctor suddenly gets called away, Mr. Harrison faints, and then everyone has to leave with him. But they do believe that because they caught the killer, Peter, who we know is innocent, if we've been paying attention, that she's probably okay. But I've got to be honest, it's sort of shenanigans to leave her alone, even if it does make for a very iconic ending. That poster in the back there, it's got a sort of chivalric tendency to it, but it's like someone watching over, like she has a knight watching over her. I think that's interesting. I mean, she is being watched over now, but she is going to be left alone. There's this kind of deflated energy now, bless him, and this is where we get a touch I absolutely love. As much as I complain about it being used for plot conveniences, I just adore that Mr. Harrison faints here. As I said, he is the best character. He is a stalwart source of dignity, quiet suffering, reminding you that what's been seen has been tragic, that the death of his daughter is tragic, and it's not just some trivial rando being killed. He has been bearing this huge burden of stress the whole time, and with Peter going, he effectively has had it confirmed that Claire is almost certainly dead, and at this point he's given out. Unconventional take, but yes, he's my best, the best character in the film for me, and I absolutely love him as a presence. And I think including him was just this wonderful, mature touch. But of course, because we're being trusted a bit as an audience here, we're going to have another one of these extremely long shots, and we're going to move into a mobile camera here. And that mobile camera is making us think of the subjective camera. Not exactly. It's going to be smoother than that, but it is going to make us think subjective. And we're going to take this moment to soak in the horror of what we've seen in this house. Just, for instance, the bloodstained bed there that we can see in Barb's room, reminding us something awful happened. There's now an absence there. We're going to scan back over all these photos. Christmas lights looking kind of sinister there now, kind of out of place. We're going to see something that basically looks like Claire's room, like a children's room, with the bag already packed. It's suggesting so much finality, like her innocence is gone. but we're also still wondering, where is Billy? And this use of the subjective cam is bringing us back to him because we know it's not been resolved. We have that information. It's this kind of nice, slow, tension building time to remind us what happened and to remind us to take it seriously. That is a hallmark of a much more mature horror, and a kind of horror I wish we saw more of. This is being absolutely non-disposable, and this is why it sticks with us. Not just the ambiguity, not just the more interesting psychological devices, not just the really great editing that builds these connections between scenes and builds up themes in our mind, but the fact that we can get this return. Just Billy opening the door and us having all the information we need. This really haunting close-out shot that actually it hasn't been resolved. And thematically, maybe it's not been resolved because the things that were the cause of Billy to start haunting this place haven't been resolved, and in fact have only intensified. But of course we're leaving our film and we're drawing out now. But we're going to hear, we're not going to see Jess dying. We're not going to see the terrible suggested definitive ending that the studio wanted, where Chris is revealed to be the killer, because thank goodness that does not make any sense at all. It would not work with the timeline. But the fact that we're going to hear the increasingly loud phone call is telling us, no, Billy is still out there, and I'm afraid Jess's fate is not looking good. None of the remakes have got close to this. But it's this kind of subtlety that keeps me coming back to it. And this to answer Nick Mancuso's question, why 40 or even now 50 years on, why do we keep coming back to Black Christmas? Well, it's all those elements. It's a much more mature horror film with a lot more going on and a lot more to say. Or at least a lot more that you can read in it, contra the director's intentions. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this commentary. I've got several others that I'm covering as part of this series. Fright Night, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Exorcist, The Shining. Now, if any of those are of interest to you, then please do watch the others in this series. Thanks very much for listening to my commentary, and I hope you enjoyed it. Merry Christmas.